to.
Good afternoon. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APEX, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you for joining us for what will be a lively discussion on AAPIs and the 2020 census. We're honored today to have KPAC Chair and APEX Board Member Congresswoman Judy Chu to provide welcoming remarks. Congresswoman Chu represents the 27th District of California and sits on the House Ways and Means Committee, as well as the House Small Business Committee. Congresswoman Chu, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Madeline, and thank you all for joining today's APEX webinar on the 2020 census. And thank you to APEX for organizing this event. As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAC, I want to start by wishing everyone a very happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I know under normal circumstances, we would be having a huge celebration all together in person right now. But unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic has made that impossible. Still, it means so much that our community has found other ways to celebrate virtually so that we can come together like this. Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is all about celebrating our contributions, our history, and our future in this country. And so I'm particularly happy that APEX decided to highlight the 2020 census this month, because this is such an important topic for our community. There's so much at stake in the 2020 census that will shape the lives of millions of AAPIs over the next decade. The results of the census will determine how over $1 trillion in federal funding is allocated to states and localities to fund hospitals, roads, schools, and other critical resources in our communities. It will also determine how countless policy and decisions in the business are made, as well as how many congressional seats are apportioned across the country. The 2020 census is also how we can demonstrate the growth of AAPIs across the country, but it can also shed light on our needs. The census is how we know which communities are struggling in terms of education, housing, and access to healthcare, as well as other critical issues for our community. And as our community continues to grow, being counted is how we ensure we are getting the resources and the support that we need. The decennial census is already underway, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, the Census Bureau has delayed typical outreach, such as knocking on doors and conducting in-person follow-up on hard-to-count communities. As a result, we are seeing less participation than in the past. Areas with a large concentration of immigrants and limited English proficient individuals in particular are being undercounted. To put that into perspective, more than 2/3 of AAPI adults are immigrants, and over 1/3 of AAPIs are limited English proficient. And we're seeing that census tracts with a large proportion of AAPIs in major cities are responding to the census at a lower rate than the nation overall. This is particularly dangerous for the AAPI community. In so many ways, an undercount of AAPIs in the 2020 census could set our community back for the next decade to come, because it's not just the quality of our schools and roads that will be determined. Even the political representation of the AAPI community will be shaped by the results of the 2020 census. And that makes knowing where AAPI voters live even more important. There are more AAPIs holding office today than ever before, but an undercount in the 2020 census could mean losing AAPI representation in the decade to come. Admittedly, in the midst of everything that's happening right now, it's easy to forget that the 2020 census is still ongoing. However, completing the 2020 census and encouraging others to do the same is actually a simple but impactful way to ensure that our communities have the resources that they need in the future to recover fully from the crisis and prepare for future disasters. Thankfully, we have some amazing leaders and advocates here who are working tirelessly to ensure that our AAPIs do not face an undercount in the 2020 census. Today, we're joined by Christine Chen of API Vote, John Yang from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, who all have been tremendous champions in making sure that the API community understand that the census is safe, secure, and confidential. And more importantly, these organizations are working together to ensure that adequate outreach is being conducted to our immigrant and limited English proficient communities. And we also have Martico Carpenter, who is leading on the census through her work at Nielson and her work at National ACE, as well as Linda Shim, who through her work at NBC Universal has been working on media outreach on the 2020 census to the AAPI community. And on a side note, Linda also used to be my chief of staff. So I'm glad that you have a wonderful panel gathered here today. During these challenging times, we will need everyone's help to ensure a complete count of the AAPI community in the 2020 census and beyond.
Thank you for your leadership, Congresswoman. I appreciate you taking the time to share remarks with us this afternoon. Before we get started, a reminder to all those who are watching us on Facebook, please post your questions in the comment section. If you are watching us on the webinar, please post your questions in the chat box. So let's get started. Today, we are joined by community leaders representing Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, API Vote, EPIC, as well as community partners Nielson and Comcast Nbc Universal. Moderating this panel is Greg Orton, National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, known as NCAPA. So thank you to our panel for sharing your knowledge and insight. Greg, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Madeline, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those who might be on the West Coast, and welcome to everyone who is joining us on Facebook as well. And let's be honest, we might all be a little zoomed out by now, but it's always nice to be able to do these kinds of panels with friends, especially when it's on an important topic. So it's certainly my pleasure to be with you all today, and hopefully through our conversation, you all gain a better insight as far as what the API community is doing in response to having to deal with COVID-19 in the census, and then also hear from business leaders as far as how they're responding as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I'll do this quite quickly so we can just jump straight into it. First, Martico Carpenter, who is the Vice President of Strategic Community Alliances at Nielson. We have John Yang, who's the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Linda Shim, who's the Executive Director of External Affairs at Comcast. Tobias Samuela, who's the Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, and Christine Chen, who's the Executive Director of API Vote. Like I said, all good friends of mine. I can speak personally to the quality of their work and their commitment to this. And so, without further ado, let's just jump straight into this. Starting with John. So COVID-19 happened. We're here. Our lives have been disrupted fundamentally, but that doesn't change the importance of the census and sort of what's at stake. And so, could you give us an update on sort of what's happening next with the census and what this means for AAJC?
Thank you, Greg. And thank you to Madeline and APEX for hosting this discussion. It's obviously a very important discussion during this time. And thank you to Representative Chu for her remarks about talking about the importance of the census. And I have to give a special shout out to her district. Her district is overperforming, so to speak. Currently, the national response rate to the census is 59.8%. And her district is overperforming by about 6 percentage points. So the outreach that she is doing to her within her community clearly is working. And I think that's what I really want to talk about, is the fact that COVID-19 doesn't change the fundamental fact that we all need to respond to the census. The census obviously started in early January. Part of it is in this new time, trying to figure out how to reach out to our communities is essential. When I talk about our communities, Representative Chu talked about the importance of our community and the fact that they are a largely immigrant community. About 1 in 6 Asian Americans have never participated in a decennial census. And so figuring out how to reach out to them, especially in this time, is going to be critical. What that means is in terms of the outreach that's being done by groups like API Vote, groups like EPIC, and the business community from Comcast and Nielson will be critical as well. Let me talk through a little bit about what has changed in COVID-19 and what the Census Bureau is doing. Fundamentally, you can still respond to the census right now. You can respond online, you can respond by telephone. If you have received the form, if you haven't responded yet, you should have received the form in the mail. You can respond by mailing that form in, and it is critical that you do that. Because of COVID-19, the dates have been extended. So previously, we had until July 31st to respond online and respond in these different ways. Under the new plans, the deadline is now October 31st. So you have until October 31st to engage in all of these different means, and then your census form will count. One of the unfortunate aspects, though, is that the field operations for the Census Bureau had to be suspended for good reason with respect to the health crisis that is before us right now. And so what's happened now is that the Census Bureau and its staff has suspended its operations and is waiting for clearance from CDC, which it is following very strictly with respect to how that staff can get back out into the field. Typically at this time, you would have started seeing staff in the field do what we would call non-response follow-up. That's what I always call the door knockers. For the people that haven't responded yet, you would start seeing people out in the field trying to collect that information and then knocking on people's door to get that in-person response. And that's important for the Asian American community. The Asian American community is like many communities of color that in terms of our self-response rate, that's always going to be a little bit uneven, and relying on that community outreach, relying on that one-on-one outreach would be critical. Certainly in this time, as we look at the statistics, Asian Americans are underreporting when it comes to large cities. In large cities right now, we are underreporting compared to the national average by about 3 to 5 percentage points. So there's clear work that needs to be done. With respect to what the Census Bureau is doing, they recently announced that they actually have started doing some field work in 9 states where those states have deemed it safe to do so. Their hope is to open up their field operations and all of their offices by June 1st, and then to get those door knockers, the enumerators, out into the field by about early mid-August. So in terms of what that means for our community and in terms of what we tell our community is to be on the lookout for these various things. Whether it is some of the field operations that are beginning now, which for those field operations, people will be leaving a reminder about the census, what we call a follow-up lead, reminders, and then they will not actually engage with those residents one-on-one. But then starting in August, the hope is, depending on where the pandemic is at this point, and whether all of these shelter-in-place mechanisms have been lifted, the hope is that we will have census workers that are engaging in those one-on-one conversations to get that information from the community. Certainly, these things may still change in the future, and I think that's what all of us, all of our groups, all the businesses are trying to adapt to at this time, figuring out how to reach out to our community in these different ways to make sure that they know about the importance of the census. They know about how critical it is for our community when it comes to political representation, when it comes to federal funding, when it comes to businesses and where stores might open that will serve our community. But the bottom line is this, is please respond. There are a lot of resources that are out there. For AAJC, we have a website, countusin2020.org, that has fact sheets in 23 different Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander languages that can help give people some assistance in understanding what the census is, how to respond, understanding what an enumerator, what a door knocker looks like. The other thing that we have partnered with APIA Vote on is a census hotline. So if you have questions about the census, you could call this number 844-2020-API, 844-2020-276. And that hotline is staffed in 8 different languages, 8 different Asian languages. And that provides an additional resource that people can go to understand the census and understand how to respond. The Census Bureau itself is staffed also with people that can respond on the phone in several different Asian languages. And the way it's set up now is if you don't get someone live right away, they do have a callback option. Bottom line is this, is we want people to respond. We are all working on different mechanisms to make sure that our Asian community has the resources that they feel comfortable in responding. Last thing I might say there is, I think this group of advocates, the people that are watching this webinar, people that are watching us on Facebook Live, probably already know this, but the census form is just 10 questions. There's no citizenship question on the census. All of us work hard to make sure that that would not appear. And so it's critical that we take these easy steps to make sure that literally our community is visible and counted. Thank you.
Thanks, John. You took my follow-up straight out of my mouth. Having filled out my census form, it really doesn't take that long. And so I think it's really important to convey that message to our family and friends. It really doesn't take that long, but it's really important. So moving right along, and thanks, John. We'll switch it up a little bit. And, I think it's important to also understand what the business community is doing and how this all sort of connects. And so Mariko, how has Nielsen adjusted to this new normal in terms of the initial disruption of, the census timeline, and sort of what are the insights you can share as to why the census is important from a business perspective, but also to the community?
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to, first of all, say that I'm really honored to be in the company of all these folks here who are leaders. I know each of these organizations very well, and the work that you do is really, really so critical. So I thank you as an AAPI. I thank you as somebody who is working with communities at Nielsen for all the work that you guys do for the census. Just to sort of, shift gears a little bit, John really talked about the impact of census in our community. And I thought I would just share with you the impact of census when it comes to businesses, right? And why it's important for AAPI, again, to be counted, because we at Nielsen, we are a consumer, the world's largest consumer measurement research company. And we provide data to our clients that are used to make big decisions about the US market. And so it's really, really important that those data is reflective of the diverse US population. And really, we use the census data town by town, block by block level to determine the makeup of our panel, right? That includes the race, age, gender, socioeconomic class, all these characteristics. And we combine that census data with this large set of data that really allows us to together provide data and insights to our clients that are serving our community. And so it is so important when I go and I talk to these big marketing, departments of these organizations, that I go and I use these numbers to really, really amplify why Asian American market is so important for the business community. We want them to think about us when they're thinking about, when Target is thinking about where to open its next store. We want them to think about our needs when, when Walmart is thinking about what products to put on their shelves, right? When NBC is trying to think of what type of content to greenlight for the next season. We want to see Asian American representation. So all of that, we really have taken sort of a leadership role in educating the public, educating our clients, our business community on the importance of census that really influence business decisions. And at Nielsen, we have an amazing government affairs team that's really have worked with, lobbying policymakers throughout. We became, a national census partner in mid-2019, and really they've been lobbying for more funding, for the extension of the deadline. But in addition to the work that the government affairs stakeholder does, we actually at Nielsen created a task force, a Census 2020 task force that really had all the stakeholders of different divisions at Nielsen, as well as our external advisory council. So these are external people, leaders of the community. And together we created this task force to really have a impactful communication plan for our network. So we actually created an advertising campaign called Project True Count that was really meant to be a resource for our client partners. So on that site, I talk about all your organizations so that, our client partners can go in there and look to see if they want to, if an Asian ERG wants to find out what they can do. They could be more, they would be made aware of all the work that you guys are doing. We have the community affairs teams that have been working with community leaders, such as the individuals here, but communities of all colors, right? And really funding them and working with them on getting the word out. We have a really, really robust ERG, and we've been engaging them in the conversation, because really they are the voices. They are in their communities, and they're also champions within our company. And last but not least, we also have Nielson Foundation. A lot of corporations have a foundation arm that's separate, but it's really important to engage the conversations there, right? So that they can fund, whether it's NCAPA or Advancing Justice, or any of these organizations, to really help the community organizations to carry out their mission. But I guess what I'm most proud of what Nielsen did was that we really have a leader, our CEO, David Kenny, who really has championed Census 2020 and the accuracy and a fair count from the get-go. He was very public. A lot of companies were reluctant to go public in terms of having conversations about the census questions, funding. They've been reluctant, but David Kenny really went out there. He had an op-ed piece in the New York Times talking about the importance of census in the business community, but personally too, and on his social media, he's been creating videos and really pushing for participation, and that has really made a big difference. It's made a big difference because it tells the business community that the top has to get involved, right? And they can make a big difference. So, we realize that our work is not done. We have to keep our foot on the gas to really push for everyone in our network to respond. But again, thank you to these amazing organizations that are really working day and night to make this all impactful for our community. So thank you, AAPIs, as well, for organizing this event.
Thanks, Mariko. And now turning it over to Linda at Comcast. Same question, from NBC Comcast's perspective, how have you all approached this change in the way the census is operating? And also, from a company perspective, what resources or commitments have you all made to make sure that the census goes smoothly?
Thanks, Greg. And a huge thanks to Madeline and her team over at AAPIs for organizing this panel today. As Congresswoman Chu mentioned, I was her former chief of staff and worked heavily with a number of the partners that are here speaking today to really make sure that her district and the AAPI community had a strong turnout for the census. So John, thank you for that data. I'm so glad to hear that her district is overperforming. That's a great testament to her team and their hard work right now. But as the other panelists mentioned, census data just has a huge impact on the many decisions that are made throughout the country. And, especially at Comcast Nbc Universal, we rely heavily on census data. And so we just wanted to make sure to help out, do our part, and ensure that there is a fair and accurate count this year. So Comcast Nbc Universal, we're a company that's made up of cable, broadband internet service, media, that's just to name a few. Mariko touched on how NBCU may need the data. It certainly helps us inform where we invest and how. So it's certainly in our favor to really make sure that there's an accurate count. So just to give you a little bit of information on what we as a company have been doing and how it kind of flowed into our COVID-19 response. Knowing that this was going to be the first digital census, I think our company was in a unique place to really utilize our assets to help out with the census effort. So we partnered up with the Census Bureau as well pretty early on and try to come up with a comprehensive plan. And because I think some of our focus had been on the digital aspect, that worked out fairly well as we were making the transition into our COVID-19 response as a whole. So we, as a company, will be investing more than $2 million in grants and in-kind contributions to support the effort. Early on this year, we kicked off a comprehensive campaign to educate people about the census and how they can participate online. And, we wanted to increase participation by using our news channels at NBC Universal and Telemundo, as well as our cable networks. So we also engaged our network of nonprofit community partners in areas where we operate and the markets that we're located in. And giving back to the communities where our employees and customers live is certainly one of our core principles. So we work directly with the community stakeholders on the ground as they were leading their own grassroots efforts. So I'm going to just briefly mention a few initiatives that we rolled out this year, also to inform, especially this crowd, if there are other ways that we can partner moving forward. As Mariko mentioned, our work is not done, and especially with the deadline that's been extended, we want to make sure to continue to evolve our census plan as well. So I'll start off with talking about PSAs. PSAs are extremely important, so we developed and put out bilingual announcements that feature Comcast NBCU talent like Joy Reid from MSNBC and Jose Diaz-Balart from Telemundo. We also partnered with organizations like AARP, API Vote, and TDW to air PSA subtitled in API languages. So for these PSAs especially that are targeting AAPIs, we work together to identify AAPI population centers within our markets, and we targeted them with the PSA subtitled in the most used API languages in the area. And we needed to use census data to help us with that. So another reason why census is important. And so far, our PSA total spot count reached about 75,000, and we're providing an approximate value of about $1.6 million in airing of PSAs alone. Just as a whole, we've been working with organizations like Fair Count and many others to air their PSAs as well. So next, I just want to quickly touch on Telemundo really quickly because they have done so much work. They actually developed a 2-year campaign to educate Spanish-speaking individuals about the census through their broadcast, cable, and digital platforms. From our last count, at least 4,000 individuals use Telemundo's website to directly access their census form. So, if you are engaging in work with Hispanic partners, be sure to share that information as well. And then on our Xfinity cable platform, we created a census destination page that hosts PSAs and other videos. We certainly wanted to especially put up videos that dispelled myths about the 2020 census. John and others have touched on the citizenship question, so we certainly wanted to make sure to get our FAQs and the Dispel the Myths PSAs up there as well. So if you are a Xfinity customer, you can say census or 2020 census into your voice remote and you can reach that page. But if you also have information that's helpful for us to put up there, please feel free to get in touch with me. We're still populating that page as time goes on. So we're happy to work with you all to do that. We also opened our Xfinity Wi-Fi hotspots so that individuals in our service areas could fill out the form online for free. This was our initial plan for census, and then it just became a part of our general COVID-19 response effort. So our Wi-Fi hotspots in public places are still open, and we hope that people will continue to use it for census as well. We also developed a plan to work with our Internet Essentials partners on the ground who work specifically with hard to count communities. For those of you who are not familiar with Internet Essentials, it's our broadband internet service program that we provide to low-income families for $9.95 a month, or for free right now to new customers during the pandemic. So we recognized early on that many of our customers, IE customers, live in hard to count areas. So we worked with the Census Bureau to develop toolkits that we sent out to our IE partners. We also sent out 26,000 direct mailers to customers in hard to count areas. And so we hope that those communities have been touched on through our efforts as well. And finally, I just wanted to mention that, Mariko mentioned that all of our entities have community investment arms. So our community investment team also provided $500,000 in grants to local nonprofits to support their census efforts, which include a few AAPI organizations as well in Colorado and California, and I believe Washington State. We've seen them do a lot of fun things in this COVID-19 environment to do census outreach, like social distance census parades and, running other messaging campaigns. So we're glad that we could be a little bit helpful there. So with that, I just want to say, those are just some of our key initiatives, and we're continuing to monitor how the current pandemic is impacting the crowd count. So I hope we can work with all of you moving forward to see if we can help in other ways.
Thanks, Linda. And a quick reminder for everybody, both on Facebook and here in the Zoom chat, feel free to submit your questions to us so that we can sort of look at them and make sure they're queued up. If time permits at the end of this, we'll be happy to sort of shift gears and have our panelists answer those questions. I saw Daphne Kwok from AARP and Lisa from SEIU. They're in the house. Maybe in the house is not the right term anymore, but in the Zoom room or in the virtual chat doesn't have the same ring to it. So if someone has a better suggestion on how to frame that, I'll take notes for the next time I have to do one of these. But again, now shifting gears back to the community, because that's what this is really about. Tavai from EPIC, I'm curious to hear from you how EPIC has sort of approached the census and sort of the need to make sure that the PI community is also heard from, and sort of what practices, if you had to put in place to adjust for the challenges that we now face as far as being out there and on the ground.
Thanks, Greg. It's really important for me to acknowledge and note the fact that census work for all Pacific Islanders is legacy work. So my ability to speak on this panel, to call myself Pacific Islander, to name any of these things is because of advocates and elders and ancestors like Uncle Victor Kaiwi Peng, Auntie Sharon Paulo, Mary Salas, Clint Helenihi, Cowan Young. And I also want to apologize for the names that I don't know or haven't said. I say all of this to recognize that a lot of those folks are people that I never met, and they still did work that I get to reap the benefits of. And I recognize the responsibility that I have to do the same for Pacific Islanders I know and those I may never meet. And to distinguish, I don't speak on behalf of all Pacific Islanders, and I hope that everything I say still honors the depth of our community. Even before the pandemic, we were always going to have to play this role of cultural translator, of convincing and explaining to our communities what it means to participate in a system that wasn't made for them, but also truly will not transform without their engagement. And now in COVID-19, I think the census had intended that as a community, we know who we are, we know where we're from, and that it was this survey of inquiry that was going to ask and help us try to answer where we are now and what we need. And during COVID-19, it's now measuring our inequities. It's measuring all the ways that systems don't work for us. So some of you may know or have heard that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted the Pacific Islander community. That here in California, we account for 0.3% of the population, but 1.5% of the cases. And so terms like disproportionality, like inequity, mean very little without census data. So that we're measuring gaps and we're thinking about those things. And I think there's this other piece when we talk to hard to count communities, that they're telling us how hard it is to survive. So in partnership with AAJC, which is very gracious, we were able to develop materials that are in Pacific Islander languages, meeting a gap of the Census Bureau. And I think in addition to being in language, we recognize that we don't translate words, we translate concepts. That the notion that you would have to get counted in order to receive what you need is countercultural. And so we explain it differently. And I think there's this other piece where your identity may be othered or not named or aggregated everywhere else, but here in our materials and the way that we talk to you, you are centered, that we celebrate that. And so EPIC has the honor of really hosting, and we've put together this national network because I think during this pandemic, we've also had to lean really deeply into interdependence and collaboration. So our partners are also doing, they've gotten creative because we knew that as a community that doesn't really have ethnic enclaves on the continent, that we'd really be relying on in-person events, cultural affairs that can draw 20,000 people at a time, or church gatherings, faith-based networks, where I'm very clear that my pastor father is far more of a trusted messenger than I am. And so we don't have those anymore. That in fact, in a lot of ways, our cultural practices are being deemed as dangerous. And so we found other ways. I think our partners have been amazing in figuring out how to integrate census into meeting the very real, immediate, and basic needs of our communities. That previously messaging was about a far off future. So how do you talk to a community that is dying about a future that they're not guaranteed? So partners like Utopia Seattle, who have integrated census into grocery delivery. We've worked with NHPI Alliance, the Couture and Chamorro Foundation, PI Health Partnership to do phone banking. So they're calling strangers, people they haven't met before, and talking to them and listening, and also reminding them about the census. And how seen can you feel as a community to hear somebody say your name properly? There's the Motivating Action Leadership, Malo in Ontario, and their text banking. And so they're listening to people. And so I think there's this other part where we are not just talking at people, how deeply we stay in talanoa and dialogue in order to listen to what they need. I also want to really celebrate the Couture and Chamorro Foundation, who's integrated census into their online cultural classes, right? To very deeply say and clearly communicate that census is not only part of our survival, but part of our culture. So I think the last piece is also to recognize that all of these groups are also the same exact groups who are being called on to respond to COVID-19. That the people who are trying to get you counted and also trying to get you vote in the general election are also the people who now have to figure out how to stop the spread of COVID-19 in our Pacific Islander communities. It is exhausting. And still, that is the responsibility, right? That is our tautua or our service. And so what I would offer, and I think the thing that we are constantly visiting, there's a Psalm 1 proverb where it's part of the warrior's chant that says, Oma mana, which is with our lungs you go. And so just to communicate that when you are tired, take my breath so that you may get a second wind towards victory. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tavai. And for those of you listening, now you understand why I've been raving about her for so long. I think I always enjoy being on these panels because I get to sit back and listen to these like beautiful, oratory flourishes that are true and they're sincere. And I just always appreciate the fact that she keeps it real, but she keeps it genuine too, as far as speaking for the community. And I know NCAPA is certainly appreciative and grateful for having her as part of the team. So now I'd like to shift it over to someone that all of us know quite well, Christine Chen at AAPI Vote. For those, I think, like I said, everybody knows her. We know she never stops working. And I think in the context of the census, we're all better for it because there's been a lot of work to do. And, I'm just, again, grateful for her work as well. So Christine, obviously under a normal census cycle, you and API Vote would have been traveling all over the country, checking in with your partners, doing all kinds of direct work to get them prepared. What's changed? What are some of the observations you've seen and how are you adjusting to COVID-19?
Right. Thanks, Greg. And thanks, Apex, for hosting this. As Tavai had noted, a lot of these same organizations are the ones that are also trying to meet the challenges and the services that they need to provide to their clients and to their networks who are also dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit, a few of the strategies that a lot of the different nonprofits locally are turning to. Specifically right now, a lot of them are texting and using phone banking opportunities to not only check in with their networks and check in with their constituents as they're going through COVID-19, but to also as a chance to remind them about the completing the census. I do know, though, there are some challenges, like, for instance, some of the nonprofits in New York, as they're making phone calls, they're also dealing with the realities that some of the individuals have passed away, right? And so to making sure that, how do you have those kind of difficult conversations with these families at the same time trying to make sure that they get counted. Some of these also nonprofits are also helping clients complete their unemployment. Minquan specifically in New York is also trying to provide funds for cash assistance to them. But at the same time, like, they're also trying to figure out how to integrate those kind of conversations, since they are still interfacing with individuals in their community. Same thing with a number of health clinics. In Ohio, Asia is still running every day, providing services to the patients, but at the same time also trying to educate them about census. And other community-based organizations, volunteer-based organizations like OCA or PAPA, they've been collecting PPE as well as distributing meals to the elderly. And so even though they're trying to be making sure that they're protective of themselves as they're out there engaging and providing the services, they're also trying to provide that as an opportunity to, once again, educate and provide information about the census. During this time period, I think also the role of ethnic press is even more important. A number of them, especially those who are at home, are listening to the radio stations and watching TV. So, and a lot of them are also turning to the ethnic press for information about COVID-19. So as a result, there's been an opportunity to make sure that we tie in information about services and resources for your communities and tie it back into with census, because that is on everyone's minds right now as they're trying to figure out what resources are out there for their own families. AAPI votes specifically have been fortunate enough to be able to continue to work with about 150 ethnic press all across the country that are not necessarily being covered by the US Census early on. So we've been trying to work with them, even for newspapers that have stopped running because of this pandemic. They're now also turning to making sure they're able to communicate with their networks through their online services. And a lot of them are visiting their websites and receiving emails from them about the pandemic. So we're also making sure that they're receiving information about the upcoming of the census in itself. There's also other opportunities to dive into new technology. For instance, right now we're looking into geofencing marketing, where we're looking to where people are located, where there's still lower response rates, and try to figure out how can we target specific advertising on their phones while they're going through the websites, going through different pages, looking up information. The Chinese schools around the country are also using WeChat. For instance, one of our partners here in Maryland, they've continued to host classes and communicate with their constituents, but at the same time also pushing out Chinese content to really answer questions and to encourage them to look into the census and making sure that they complete it as well. I think all of us with AAPI Heritage Month, there's a lot of activities and events being organized. This is your opportunity. Can you go ahead and take one of the fact sheets or the videos that EPIC had created or Advancing Justice had created, and making sure that you launch your event with a video about the census or end it with a video. So a lot of that materials also, as we had noted earlier, is Count Us In 2020 for as well as apivote.org/census 2020. We have a lot of this information consolidated. A lot of the videos that have been created are there and made available for all of you to utilize.
Thanks, Christine. And I'm pretty sure, now I'm convinced that this is a panel full of pros because we're actually on time, which never happens. So we actually have a decent amount of time to answer some questions. I know a few of you have sent a few, so maybe we'll try to knock out some of the easy ones, starting with you, Linda. There was a question about more information on the grants that Comcast was providing related to census. Do you have any more information you'd like to share there?
Yeah, and I saw the question was from Louisa Blue. Hi, Louisa. Good to see you virtually. um, we have really relied on, especially for the grants for census, we've relied on our regional and division offices. We really wanted them to be making the decisions on who had the local trust and support within the community in terms of who to give the grants to. But I'm happy to circle back with you, Louisa, directly, and with others who have similar questions to kind of see how some of the local groups that you're working with might be able to get in contact with our offices on the ground, and happy to do that. And I think someone just made a point that as the pandemic, with the pandemic, people have, and as Christine mentioned, people have had to retrigger some of their strategies on outreach. So I certainly want to take that back to our company as well and see if that kind of can inform our next stage of census engagement. Like, is there more that we can do to help support some of the changes that have been made by the advocacy organizations to reach out?
Great, thanks, Linda. And I see that Congresswoman Mang has joined us. And so for those of you who have stuck with us, you'll have the opportunity to hear from her in a few minutes. We'll take a few more questions. One that I saw, and I'll give this one over to John. There's a question about how the census impacts non-residents or folks who aren't citizens, and sort of, fair questions about whether or not how we should approach that, how should we try to count them, and sort of the implications of that as well. I know it's something that you've talked about at length leading up until this point. Certainly that hasn't changed. So if you want to provide some insights there.
Sure. Thank you, Greg, and thanks for the question. First and foremost, the census under the Constitution requires that we count all persons in the United States. They make no distinctions about citizens, permanent residents, etc. The point of the census, among other things, is to make sure we know who is living in this country. Now, when I looked at the question, it seemed like there was a little bit of vagueness about what it means to be a non-resident. And for the census purposes, it is anyone that is living regularly in the United States on April 1st of 2020. Those are the people that are supposed to be counted. So if someone is coming here on a tourist visa that happens to be here on April 1st, they are not supposed to be counted under the Census Bureau guidelines, under the way we conduct the census. But the reason why we are counting more than just citizens, more than just permanent residents, is the reality is that the services that this country needs to provide extend beyond citizens, extend beyond permanent residents to everyone that is living here. And that is true of schools, that is true of roads, that is true of hospitals. And certainly that's true of businesses too, is that for anyone that is regularly in the United States, regardless of immigration status, they're going to want to shop at a business. They're going to want to be able to get the services that they need. If they need to go to a hospital, they need to go to a hospital. And so if we don't have the right demographics, if we don't have the right count of people in the United States, then those stores won't be there. The stores won't be stocked in the proper ways. Hospitals and schools won't be there to serve our community as a whole. And so that's why it's important at bottom to count everyone in the United States.
Thanks, John. I saw a good question here. And maybe I'll give this one to you, Christine. Is the Census Bureau still hiring people who speak Asian languages? And do they have enough capacity?
Yeah, and John can also help answer that as well. They are still hiring. They actually have, if anything, they actually need to look into actually increasing their capacity, especially for those that are bilingual. There are certain needs in different areas. John, if you want to talk a little bit more about deadlines, that I actually haven't kept up with that.
Sure. No, thanks, Christine. And that's absolutely right. It's actually, they are behind in hiring in certain respects. Actually, they just started, they announced that they are starting to fingerprint again. So part of the application process requires fingerprinting, and that obviously requires some in-person contact of certain sorts. So in a number of states, they're open to doing that again. And the reality is, the Census Bureau will tell us that they are, quote unquote, on track with respect to hiring. But we know that when it comes to those enumerators, the people that are on the ground going to the actual houses, they're behind. and they're behind with people that really represent our communities, the language capacity that Christine is talking about. So for people that are interested in applying, absolutely, the window is still open. You should call your local field office is one way to do it. You could go to usajobs.gov. Frankly, that's a cumbersome process. I actually think that the better process is to make contact with one of the local field offices, because they'll be able to walk you through the process in a way that's a little bit more personal. And like I said, some of those offices are just starting to open up right now. And so the hope is that they could really process these applications.
Thanks, John and Christine. I want to take it back to a point that Mariko raised early on in this, in terms of how census data is used by the business community and how important it is. Sometimes I feel like that's lost. And that's actually a really important point that, if anything, we should continue to drive home, because from an advocate perspective, we're always trying to make the case with data to make the case that AAPIs need to be included, to have a seat at the table, to be recognized by either decision makers at the top or by the business community at large. So Mariko, if you could go back to that and sort of kind of expand on that point, as far as from Nielsen's perspective, how important this information, accurate information, really is for the business community.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. In my role at Nielsen, I go, as I had mentioned earlier, I go in front of these big corporations and I talk about the Asian American consumer market. We know that marketers have been pretty slow in investing in our group. And so I just think about, oh my goodness, if we didn't have that data that talked about all of our the size, right? How we would be missing out on our opportunities. I think it's also very important for the AAPI community specifically because of the rate of growth, right? We are growing so much, and so the big part of the attention that we're getting out of marketers is because we are going to be representing the future, right? We are the young community that is going to be creating the trends, setting the trends going forward, which is why we need companies to pay attention to the things that we need and the preferences that we have. So yeah, Greg, thank you for sort of, echoing that. So if there's anybody who doesn't care about hospitals or schools, but you care about your, hair product or your store around the corner, like all of it, you have to make sure that we are definitely counted.
Thanks, Mariko. And then I saw one final question that I know it's something that I've asked John, as far as college students and folks that are still in school. One, how are they counted? But then two, and maybe this is one for everybody, how can they get involved? Because truly, we know now that we're all online, this is a young people's game. They understand technology in a way that, many of us don't. I like to think that I'm still kind of young and I kind of get it, but I'm realizing very quickly there are things that I don't understand. So anyways, John, so could you tell us more about how college students are counted and are treated under the census, and then also how they might get involved?
Sure. So let me talk about how they are counted under the census, and then really defer to Christine and maybe to Vi as to the outreach or what college students can do, because they're much better at the on-the-ground game than I am. In terms of how they are counted, it's actually relatively simple. If you would have been in college on April 1st, and that's where you would have been living on April 1st, that is where you should be counted. The college that you would have been attending, the dorm that you would have been in, that is the location with which you are counted. The fact that you ended up having to go back home because of COVID-19 does not change that calculation. So that's the easy answer. Now, there are some intricacies about how that is being done, because the universities typically would have had a hand in the process of counting people in the dorms, but I wouldn't want people to worry about that. If anything, I would just have college students that are back home, just go ahead and respond on your own. You should not be counted at the residence that you're living in right now, whether it's your parents' home, on your own. The universities and the Census Bureau will work out what we call deduplicating that information. If there's a double count, they'll figure it out. What we would want people to do is respond now at that college location.
Christine or Tavai, any final words?
Yeah, let me jump in. It's true. Actually, there's a number of our college students, they actually had launched a campaign on TikTok to get the conversation started, because we're also relying on students to have the conversation with their family members about completing the census, right? And so I think it's really important to make sure that we continue to have students in their space, continue to talk about it and the importance of it, and to make sure that you realize that you don't need the letter. You could just go to my2020census.gov to complete the census for, especially for those of you who were living in an apartment if school had continued on April 1 in the normal sense. I also noted that for anyone that's interested, we can also plug you into local efforts. Or if you would like to help with phone banking, not only to check on our community, but to also making sure that they complete the census. I encourage you to just email us at census@apiavote.org, and we could plug you into whether it's our youth initiatives on the campuses or with our local partners on the ground.
Alrighty, thank you all for your insightful answers. It'll be my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Grace Meng from the 6th District of New York. But before I do that, I want to recognize that while certainly all of our panelists have great insights, and there are a number of NCAPA members on the panel, NCAPA is the umbrella coalition of 36 of the largest AAPI organizations in the country. There are a number that aren't here, but that doesn't mean that they're not doing fantastic work. The Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance is one that I have to recognize because, as we all know, they really are the engine that's driving a lot of our civic engagement work. And so I want to make sure they get recognized for that. Certainly, if you're on social media, as we all are these days, you've seen plenty of their, great material and assets that they put out. Certainly look forward to more work from them, as well as John and Christine and Tavai, Nielson and Comcast as well. So without further ado, it's certainly my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Meng, who's been a fantastic champion for the community, has been hard at work, certainly during this difficult time, introducing legislation that I'm sure she'll talk about. But speaking as a former Hill staffer, I can't say enough about what it means to have a member of Congress truly represent our community in a way that doesn't not just herself, but also her team and her staff and the work and the way they approach it. So Congresswoman, thank you for joining us, and please bring us home.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Greg, for those incredibly kind words. And thank you to everyone. I mean, this is such an all-star cast. I just came back home. We were at our local hospitals, and I jump on and I see all of your faces. It wasn't in context, but it was just really reassuring as a member of our community to see all of you together. So thank you so much. And thank you, as always, Madeline, for bringing us together, and for the APAC staff for helping to organize today's webinar. Thank you. I know that our KPAC chairwoman, Congresswoman Judy Chu, was on earlier with all of you. So thankful for her leadership. And I've said this on other venues before, but not just for the AAPI community, but her efforts in bringing together other caucuses and expanding and strengthening our coalition by working with other groups, I think has really proved to bear fruit a lot in the last few weeks and months. So I'm very thankful. And I hope you and your families are all well and safe during these COVID-19, this pandemic. Despite the challenges ahead to heal from the effects of COVID-19, we obviously still have to work together and work in more creative and effective ways to make sure that we have an accurate count in our AAPI communities. Data from the census, as you know, is used for everything that the government does, from how we determine the distribution of congressional seats to how we allocate over $1 trillion in federal resources to states, municipalities every fiscal year. And we even see it in the upcoming bill that Congress is going to vote on, how much they depend on census figures. And we've seen, especially during this pandemic, how it can be so important for immigrant and underserved communities. And I will say, we've all in our various capacities have been emphasizing the importance of the census, and we work closely on this issue. And sometimes it's always a little difficult to try to help people in our communities, especially if they're not involved and they're busy, to kind of visualize why the census is important and how it relates to their personal life. And I will say that unfortunately and sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic has helped us to more effectively explain, so here in New York, obviously, we are at the epicenter, and we're at our local hospitals and nursing homes a lot. And now I can literally say to Mrs. So-and-so, senior citizen or immigrant family, like, look, we could have more doctors and more hospital beds and more iPads for your kids who are doing homeschool if we did a better job at the census last time. And so unfortunately, those examples have been brought to real life for so many people in hotspots like New York. And I'm proud to represent one of the most diverse districts. As you know, the AAPI community is the fastest growing community in the country. There are now over 22 million Asian Americans in the US. And by 2060, Asian Americans are expected to increase over 4 times as rapidly as the total US population and grow to more than 47 million. But, we know that we are growing in power and number, but almost none of that matters if we are not counted during this census. So we all know that we have a lot of work to do. We cannot allow an undercount. I am so thankful for all of your advocacy day in and day out. The Census Bureau's 2018 report found that Asian Americans were the least likely of any racial group to report that they intend to complete the census. And so as the AAPI member of Congress to sit on Appropriations Committee, this committee, the subcommittee CJS, is responsible for funding our federal government, including the Census Bureau. We helped secure about $7 billion for the census to ensure adequate funding is provided so that we could have a more accurate count. Congresswoman Chu and I have worked closely to make sure that the Bureau provides outreach in as many languages and through as many mediums as possible, and to hopefully extend their outreach efforts and extend their timeline. So I just wanted to jump on the call today to say thank you. All of these stats I'm reading off to you, you already know, better than me. But I will say that, again, in light of this pandemic, I don't want to say that we have an opportunity, but the importance of the census is really highlighted, and people are seeing, it manifested in real life situations around New York and around the country. And so, it's even more important than ever. So thanks all for your work, and feel free to reach out if we can be of any help.
Thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for joining us today and for being such a advocate for our community as well as all constituencies. It's so important that we have you there in Congress, and we appreciate all that you do in support of our community. So thank you. To our audience, thank you so much for tuning in today, and to our community leaders and partners for joining us. This is such a great discussion because it's so vital for our community to be counted. You hear it time and time again. So I mentioned earlier that there will be a recording issued after we finish today, so that for those who were unable to watch it live, they can watch it at their convenience. So please feel free to share the recording to others. In continuing our fireside chats, we have an exciting week ahead. Tomorrow, we have the Honorable Jill Otake as part of APEX in Conversation at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you haven't registered, there's still time to RSVP. Next week on Monday, May 18th, we have the Honorable Nisha Desai-Biswal, former Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, as well as a very special edition of APEX in Conversation on Wednesday, May the 20th, starting at noon, where we will be featuring KPAC members throughout the day in celebration of APOM. So I'd like to also thank the APEX team for all of their hard work in putting this together. Thank you to our community partners and leaders, and to all of you, thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.